Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another writing video. Today I've got a little craft chat for you today, and I'm going to be talking about something that might be slightly contentious, but I think it has to be said. Today I'm going to be just absolutely going for the jugular at the age-old writing advice, show don't tell, and basically talking about why following this advice too closely is what's ruining your writing. I mean, maybe it's not ruining your writing. I haven't read your writing. Maybe you're doing great. But I would say that this is the biggest problem that holds back intermediate writers, preventing them from getting to, I would say, the advanced stage of their development in their craft. And to be honest, it's not your fault if this is what's holding back your writing, because this is advice that you're not getting. This is the advice you're not getting told. You're getting told show, don't tell, and what you're not getting told is tell more. So in today's video, I'm just going to be talking about why telling and exposition is actually good. So to start out, I want to be clear that show, don't tell is still good advice. And I'm not actually here saying show, don't tell is bad advice. I guess what I'm trying to say is that show, don't tell is not complete advice. It's very incomplete advice. And I actually think that show, don't tell is extremely important advice for new writers. Learning to show is an extremely important skill. You need to know how to show, and you need to be able to show effectively. The point of this video isn't to say tell, don't show, or that showing is bad, but it's to say that telling is actually also really important. And your writing probably benefits from more telling than you think it does. So what often happens is when you're learning to write, the piece of advice that you are going to get over and over and over and over is show, don't tell. So therefore, a lot of writers focus a lot on learning to show, which is great because learning to show is super important. But what also happens then is writers essentially become afraid of telling, and they become afraid of exposition. They avoid telling and exposition at all costs. A lot of issues can arise from that. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the issues that can happen when you avoid telling and you essentially become afraid of telling. There are a lot. First of all is clarity issues. Telling is very straightforward. If you avoid telling at all costs, you can run into a lot of clarity issues because you're trying to imply everything. Clarity issues were my biggest issue in my writing for a very long time, something I really struggled with, and dealing with clarity issues can be really hard to iron out because by nature you think it makes sense, so it's extremely hard to spot clarity issues in your own work. And I do believe that the reason I had so many clarity issues is because I was afraid of telling. The second one is purple prose or overwrought phrasing, because they think that a sentence like the sun set is telling, and so they rewrite it into something like the fiery orb descended languidly through the sky, thinking that that's showing and the previous one was telling. You know, I've seen writers literally avoid nouns, take a noun and think that using a noun is telling, and so they try to expand the noun into essentially just another noun with multiple adjectives. Another one, just confusing phrasing or or it's really hard to visualize the imagery. Again, the phrasing becomes so overwrought because they think they can't be straight up, they can't be overt, they think that that's telling. Just overwriting or bloated writing, a bunch of unnecessary detail, padding your writing with tons of detail because you think that that's showing. Very awkward ways of revealing information. So for example, a lot of writers who are scared of telling or exposition will try to share their information through dialogue. They're scared of info dumps, they're scared of exposition, so they put it into dialogue. I would say 95% of the time it's more natural to include, maybe even more than 99% of the time it's more natural to share information through narrative than through dialogue, unless, I would say the only time it makes the most sense to put information through dialogue than narrative is if the dialogue is coming from a side character and you're in a limited perspective. If you're in first person or third person limited, and this information is only known to a side character, of course, then it has to come through dialogue. But if it's known to your protagonist, narrative is the best. Disguised telling, this is basically telling that the writer thinks is showing, right? Really common is with emotions with this. So for example, saying something like anger rushed through my body or sadness coursed through me. This is a writer who's scared of labeling an emotion or telling emotions. So instead of describing a feeling of sadness, they use the word sadness, they label the emotion, and then they just embellish it a little. I used to do this a ton in my writing. It's a super common problem. This basically happens when you're trying to show an emotion, but you don't actually really know how to show it, and so you just tell it and disguise the telling as showing. Another one, important ideas not being unpacked. We're going to get into some that are going to seem counterintuitive, right? Too much showing is actually having the opposite effect as intended. In this case, too much showing is actually costing the story depth, costing the story complexity, because if you avoid telling at all costs, you avoid any kind of straight up narrative, what happens is that important ideas in the story don't get unpacked. They're just implicit. Important ideas can be unpacked and unweaved on the page. That's interesting. That gives a story complexity, and a lot of writers start avoiding that because they think that ideas and themes and topics and emotions can only be explored through subtext, through implicit means, can only be shown. Another way, no way to access the theme. If there's such a fear of overtness, any themes can be buried so deep that there's literally no way to access them. Reverse info dumping. So this is what I call reverse info dumping, at least. This is basically long, unnecessary scenes that are only there to supplement information. So this basically happens when there's a piece of information that could be stated through exposition in a single sentence or a couple sentences. But because the writer is afraid of exposition, they include full scenes to show the information. So for example, let's say that your protagonist's dad owns a bakery. What happens is the writer is afraid of exposition, so they're afraid to include the sentence, my dad owns a bakery, which is nothing wrong with that sentence, that's good information. So instead what they do is they have a whole scene where the main character goes to visit their dad at the bakery. This scene doesn't further the plot in any way, and this scene could literally be a single sentence. So they have an entire scene that's just there to show information that could just be stated through a single line of exposition. Another one, difficulty moving through time or manipulating the timeline. A lot of writers will be afraid of chronology tags. So for example, 3 weeks later, they think that we should be shown everything that happened in those 3 weeks. Okay, but if what happened in those 3 weeks is irrelevant, we are skipping it for a reason. That's not telling. That's good writing. A clear timeline where you're clearly shown where you are as you move through a time is really important for the reader to digest your work and not be confused. But fear of telling can make writers afraid of chronology tags because they think a chronology tag is a form of telling, which it's not. Unclear character motives and traits, again, thinking that you can't state what the character wants or what the character feels or any of the character's traits or interests. It can only be shown. I think in that case, telling should work alongside showing. If you're told that a character has a certain motive but we never see it on the page, that's not good enough. It has to be felt, it has to be shown. You can state these things. The telling can supplement the showing and vice versa. It doesn't have to be only showing. Again, I used to always have in all my workshop stories in university, no one ever knew the main character's goal because I was afraid to state it. And in a short story, a lot of the time it's very subtle what the character wants deep down, not necessarily what they're pursuing physically, but deep down what they want. That's subtle. And I was too afraid to state that, so I was just trying to imply it, and people were always confused about that. Just state it. It's fine to state it. And then when people are reading it, they can see the way that it's supported. Sometimes internal motive can certainly be implicit, but it's okay sometimes to state that as well. And also just a very distant narrative, which again is super counterintuitive because you think that telling pushes the reader away and showing brings them closer. The fear of exploring emotions, thoughts, ideas, feelings, themes on the page and leaving it all to subtext can make the narrative really distant rather than immersive because nothing is actually being unpacked on the page, right? That's a lot of things, right? Those are many, many problems. And the irony is that a lot of these problems that not enough telling can cause are actually things that the writers think they're avoiding, right? A lot of these things are things that the writer is ironically trying to avoid that are then being caused. Too much showing can cause a lot of the same problems as too much telling, just in a bit of an opposite way, distant narrative, Writers often go through these stages. So as a beginner, there's too much telling. They haven't learned show don't tell, and showing is a hard skill. I think the reason that show don't tell gets hammered into our brains as writers over and over and over and over is because it's really hard. It's not something that you can just implement immediately and see a quick magical fix, Cutting filters is a great writing tip that I love because it's super fast. Just cut your filters, instant, better, boom, love it. Learning to show takes a lot of time and a lot of dedication to your craft to learn how to do it well. And so that's why it's really important advice that we hear a lot. So, and as new writers, most beginning writers tell too much. And so as a result, the writing is flat, it's distant, but then what happens is the writer learns how to show, they move into more of an intermediate stage. They know how to show, but they've never learned how to tell because no one is teaching them how to tell. Everyone is only teaching them how to show. An intermediate writer often doesn't know how to use telling effectively. They think that they should do everything in their power to avoid telling at all costs. They think exposition is the devil. due to the fact that there's not enough telling and not enough exposition, the writing becomes tangled, dense, overwrought, confusing. They deal with clarity issues, and their prose can become super hard to unpack. My old prose used to be so dense because I wouldn't state anything. Everything had to be implicit, and it didn't make sense. Nothing conveyed, right? And then I think that the advanced writer understands the importance of telling and showing and knows how to use both effectively. I still remember, and I've definitely told this anecdote before, I was in one of my university writing workshops, and it was on a break, and we were just chatting with the prof, and the prof was like, why are you guys so scared of exposition? It's like, none of your stories have any exposition in them. Like, there's zero exposition, and I don't understand why. And one of my friends was like, well, we're taught that it's bad. And she's like, oh, well, whoever's teaching you that, don't listen to them. If you want to have exposition, just write it well, right? Bad exposition feels flat and distant and like a textbook, but just write your exposition well. Make it interesting. Offer information that's compelling to the story, and the reader will be thankful for the information. I remember reading a craft essay that if I could remember what it was, I would dig it up and try to link it, but I unfortunately do not for the life of me remember which essay this was from, where the author was talking about how the base unit of a story is information. Like, a lot of the time we think of the base unit of a story as maybe a word or a sentence, but the base unit of a story is information. Like, a story is made up of pieces of information, and sometimes a piece of information is a single word, sometimes a piece of information is a clause, sometimes it's a sentence, maybe sometimes it's a paragraph. So if stories are literally made of units of information, why are we so afraid of the information? I wanted to talk about what is good telling, because there's good telling and there's bad telling, right? Good telling, first of all, is well written. Good prose, interesting in terms of phrase, well-chosen diction. A lot of the time, too much telling in a beginner writer will feel very, very distant. But I think good telling is still close to the narrator. Adds depth to the story rather than takes it away. So if you're telling too much without showing to supplement it, then you will lose depth, right? Because the character's traits, wants, goals, that's not being supported by any kind of depth. But if you use telling to add depth, so use it to add information that actually deepens ideas and concepts and characters, then your telling is actually adding depth, and it's becoming a more accessible way to access important ideas within the story, right? Good telling also supports what is shown. If what you're telling contradicts what is shown or isn't supported by what is shown, then it's not good telling. I think some information can just be told. Like the example I said earlier about the main character's dad being a baker. If you tell me, oh, my dad's a baker, I'm not going to question that. Why would I think that you're lying? I don't need to see you show up with some fresh bread rolls to be convinced that your dad is a baker. I don't need to go to your dad's bakery to believe that your dad is a baker. But if you say, my dad is super intelligent and cunning, I want to see the dad being smart on the page. I want to see him showing that he's intelligent and cunning. That's something that's a trait that's abstract, so I need to be convinced, I need evidence, I need to be shown. I can be shown and told, but if I'm only told and not shown, I'm not going to necessarily buy it. And if I'm told that and what's shown contradicts it, the dad's being a total doofus, then I'm also not going to buy it. But something concrete, that concrete information, if you tell it to me, I buy it. It doesn't need to be elaborated further. I like to think of that as you can tell information that is static, but it's good to show information that is active. So yeah, a character's job is just a fact about them. It's a static piece of information, and it can be told. In a lot of cases, static information should be told. But if it's a character's active traits, then, that's wants, personality traits, desires, then that should be shown. So it should be played out through active scene. These things can also be told, but they should be shown and told. If you tell me this character is really avoidant, they have a really avoidant personality, I need to see them acting that way to be convinced and understand why it's important to their character and to the piece. And I also think that telling can actually be a form of showing. This is big brain here, and I would recommend Heather O'Neill's work for examples of this. She does a lot of really good telling in her work where she essentially tells. It's telling, but what it is the telling is showing something deeper. So it feels like telling, it feels pretty straight up. It's actually revealing a deeper level of something that's not being stated. So telling can actually be a form of showing.
So I thought I would just quickly
show you guys an example. You could find examples of telling in pretty much anything. I was looking through the beginning of Eileen by Otessa Moshfegh. One thing I really admire about her writing is that it's very clear. I thought that this would be a great example because we have here a character study of the title character Eileen that is one of the most compelling characters you'll ever read, one of the strangest characters you'll ever read, one of the most unique characters you'll ever read. Through this very fascinating character, of course you need showing to do that, but she also uses telling. And so I was just flipping through the first few pages, and there's a lot of telling. There's a lot of stuff that you would flag as telling, but it's actually helping the story. So this is an excerpt from page 7. I just pulled this because it has a lot of details that you might flag as telling, where Eileen is basically just stating facts about herself and about her personality even, and she does this throughout this opening section and honestly throughout the book. When I was disturbed, I took some comfort in attending to my appearance. I was obsessed with the way I looked, in fact. My eyes are small and green, and you wouldn't, especially back then, have seen much kindness in them. I am not one of those women who try to make people happy all the time. I'm not that strategic. If you'd seen me back then with a barrette in my hair, my mousy grey wool coat, you'd have expected me to be just a minor character in this saga, conscientious, even-tempered, dull, irrelevant. I looked like a shy and gentle soul from afar, and sometimes I wished I was one. But I cursed and blushed and broke out in sweats quite often, and that day I slammed the bathroom door shut by kicking it with the full sole of my shoe, nearly bursting the hinges. I looked so boring, lifeless, immune and unaffected, but in truth I was always furious, seething, my thoughts racing, my mind like a killer's. It was easy to hide behind the dull face I wore, moping around. I really thought I had everybody fooled. A lot of points where she's telling, she says, I was obsessed with the way I looked. That's the kind of sentence that you would flag as telling. It is telling. Instead of showing us that she's obsessed with the way I looked by showing her, tending to her appearance, fixating on her appearance, she just says, I was obsessed with the way I looked. She just says it. But she can just say it because it, first of all, it fits the frame of the story, of her telling the story after the fact to us. She doesn't have to skirt around the facts. She knows herself, and the frame of the story allows this type of telling. And also because it's supported by what we see about her. Just a sentence later, I am not one of those women who try to make people happy all the time. Again, she just says this fact about herself. I'm not. And then she says, I'm not that strategic. These are traits about her that, again, you would expect to be shown. And they are also shown. That's why it works, is because they're told and shown. There's evidence to support these things. But the fact that it's told actually helps. It's shown, but the fact that it's told supports the showing and actually lets us get a deeper, clearer sense of the character rather than having to read through and wade through pages and pages and chapters and scenes and see her character taking shape. We know from page 7 these facts about her. Instead of seeing her being furious, seething, her thoughts race in her mind like a killer, she just says that this is what it's like, but we see her like this throughout the book. And so the telling is like a grounding point. It gives us a cornerstone. It's almost like a thesis statement. In an essay, you start with your thesis statement and then you show evidence to support it. In this opening chapter, she's giving us thesis statements about herself. She's saying, I'm like this, I'm like this, I'm like this. And throughout the rest of the book, you're going to see that play out. If it didn't play out throughout the rest of the book, this would be pretty weak writing. But it works because it's in line with what we're seeing in her character and because it's in line with the way the story is being set up. The telling actually makes sense. Not all books are set up in a way where telling makes sense or can be used in the same way. The specific retrospective nature of this novel, where she's looking back and telling a story from her past, allows her to use telling in this specific way. And I'm not saying that first-person retrospective is the only point of view where you can use telling, but just in this particular case, the telling feels very natural because of the narrative frame. So if you've been struggling with clarity issues, you feel like people don't really understand what you're going for, like they read your work, they just don't get what you're going for, the issue is very likely that there's not enough telling. It's, I think, really key as a writer to not be afraid of exposition and embrace information. If there's information that the reader needs to know and you want to share, just offer it up. Just say it. I look back on my old writing and I laugh because I feel like I used to go so out of my way to avoid to place information, and I would create really awkward scenarios just to share a single line. If it's important, just state it. Like, the reader's going to be thankful for that information. They're not going to be like, ooh, yucky information. I didn't read to learn about the character. No, that's exactly why they read. Like, you read to learn about the character and the story in the world. So don't be afraid to teach about the writing the story in the world. Just write it in an interesting way. Everything that you know about writing good prose that would apply to showing, apply to telling as well. If you start being more generous with the telling in your work, you'll actually see your work improve really fast. It'll become a lot more accessible, it'll become a lot more clear, it'll be a lot punchier, and you'll find that you get a lot of added depth because you're unpacking things on the page rather than just through subtext, just through implication. It's great to have things that exist only in subtext and implication, but your whole story doesn't need to be in subtext and implication, right? Again, we're reading to learn, we're reading to explore. I remember I used to be very afraid to let my characters just think about anything thematic, think about what they were feeling, think about their goals, their desires, think about the nuances of the situation. And there was no way to access that, and people weren't taking away what I wanted them to take away from my stories or characters. So my writing improved so dramatically when I stopped being afraid of information and started just saying things on the page. Suddenly people got what I wanted them to get out of my writing. And of course, because I was stating it. Like, the thing with telling is it's clear. Like, you can't really misinterpret telling. Like, it's right there on the page. Showing is much more up to interpretation. I also, like, and I talked about this in my old video on Show Don't Tell, I normally, in my own work, don't even really use the phrasing show don't tell. I like the phrasing describe, don't explain a lot better. But show don't tell, I think it causes a lot of problems, to be honest. I can see a lot of problems in my own work where I was so afraid of telling that the writing really suffered for it. And I think that a big part of becoming more advanced in your craft is realizing that telling is actually good, and that a good piece of writing probably actually has a significant amount of telling in it. As long as the telling is used properly and is used well, it's going to enrich your story rather than harm it. So that was my take for today. Might not be something that is talked about enough, something that I think for an intermediate writer is critical. Like, as a beginner, focus on learning to show. That's such an important skill. You really need to be able to learn how to show to be a good writer. But as an intermediate writer, it's likely that you've been focusing too much on showing because that's all you've been taught. It's not your fault. Everyone's constantly telling you telling is bad. So you're going to think that telling is bad. You're going to avoid it at all costs. And I think for most writers, they're only going to realize that telling is actually good when they see their writing starting to suffer because there's not enough telling. That's what happened to me. Scared of telling, always told to avoid telling. My writing had problems in it because I was avoiding any telling. I was avoiding exposition at all costs, and I saw that my writing was suffering for it. Suffer no longer is all I have to say. Tell things, it's all right. So that's all for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.